This is the beginning of the Ferguslie section of the Heritage Trail, which was originally a much larger complex than the one we just visited a little to the west. The building gives an important insight into both the commercial success of the thread industry in Paisley and the paternalistic ideals of the Coates family during the 19th century. As of January 2014, the Halftimers building is listed as ruinous and is viewed as being in critical condition. The school was opened in 1887 by Peter Coates Jr., who was the chairman of the school committee. It allowed the company to manage the education and work routine of its younger female employees. Before the school opened, girls would have attended various schools throughout the local area. The Halftimers school allowed the girls, who would have been aged between 10 and 14 years, to attend school one day and work in the mill the next, hence the term Halftimers. Like so many of the buildings across the two sites, it was built by the Bradford architectural practice of Woodhouse and Morley. Inside there was a large central hall and 6 classrooms for up to 400 pupils. The children were taught basic reading, writing and arithmetic. The school operated as part of the mill complex until 1904, when the Paisley School Board took over and teaching ended 4 years later. By 1921, the building was being used as a dining hall for the mill's clerical workers. Ironically, considering its subsequent fate, it was later used by the mill's fire prevention team. After the building was sold, it was used as a social club for the chemical firm Ciba-Geigy. Then it hosted 2 nightclubs, the Cotton Club, then the Institute. 2 fires took place during this time, the second of which severely weakened the outer walls. On Boxing Day 1998, a heavy storm resulted in widespread damage to an already vulnerable structure. This included the collapse of the magnificent east gable. The Bridge Lane Gatehouse stands at one of the 3 former entrances to the Ferguslie Mill site. The gatehouse was finished in the same year as the Halftimers School and was designed by the same architects. It stands directly above what remains of the original Glasgow, Paisley and Johnson Canal. The entrance to the gatehouse is topped with a round arch supported by channelled pilasters. One of the striking features of this building is the 2-stage tower that sits above the centre bay. The first stage is flanked by scrolls, and in the centre sit 2 stone circles. The second stage of the tower has a clock to each face. The gatehouse would have been used as a reception area and for various other administration and storage purposes. During the final years, it was the personnel office. It contains private housing now. Very little has survived on this site and no mills remain. A housing estate now stands where manufacturing once flourished, making it difficult to imagine a time when the entire area was covered with mills, workshops, stores and administrative buildings. The number 1 spinning mill stood here. This building was possibly the grandest and most impressive on the whole Ferguslie site. It was mostly concerned with cotton spinning and processing activities, but the building itself was constantly modified as new methodology was introduced. When the Ferguslie site was being wound down in the 1970s, all of the spinning machines were removed and twisting machinery was installed. Many of the workers were struck by the sheer size and scale of the building, and work would often be noisy, repetitive and hard.
First memories, very big workplace, massive size of flats. The amount of people was quite staggering. Didn't realise how many people actually worked there. The noise was deafening. They weren't bad conditions, but it was very hard work. Me and a few other guys would move about all the machines and physically tear the cotton with our hands. And I remember going home after a couple of days and couldn't hold a knife or fork to eat my dinner. My hands were so sore, my fingers wouldn't work.
Despite a heated campaign to save it, the Grade A listed building was finally demolished in 1992. On this part of the site, there was also an experimental mill that dated from the same time as the number 1 mill. This was Coates' research and development facility. New production techniques and mechanical processes were developed here before being implemented worldwide. Machinery was also maintained in the experimental mill, including the rollers that were used on the spinning machines. These were covered in goatskin leather to protect the cotton. It was one of the last buildings to be closed here. This is all that remains of the number 1 spinning mill. The plaque was salvaged from the mill before it was demolished in 1992 and now sits beside Station Road at the site's western boundary. The West Gatehouse also stood near here. This building looked similar to the Bridge Lane Gatehouse, but was larger and possibly even more ornate. It too was a 2-storey structure with a double-level tower housing a clock. Sadly, it was lost after years of neglect and vandalism. This mill was built in the 1930s to cater for increased demand. Many of the women who worked in the mills, like the number 2 mill, were paid in piece rates. This meant that whatever was weighed at the end of their shift was calculated to make up their wage. Sometimes they would barely stop during their shift because if they did, the machine would stop.
Everything the women produced, you weighed it. Maybe 2 or 3 barras a day was their work and that made their pay. I mean, they were at it all the time. Sometimes they never took a cup of tea because the minute you stopped working, the machine stopped. So kept busy. Time work is your pay stays the same. I've got a set rate. It was time work the whole time, which was good.
Cotton is highly flammable, and some of the processes would leave traces of cotton cobwebs around the machinery. The site had a rapid response fire team on constant standby, and smoking was prohibited in any of the processing mills or storage buildings. Despite this, the number 2 mill experienced a serious fire caused by an illicit cigarette. A major catastrophe was avoided, however, thanks to the diligence of the fire station staff. The fire station was built towards the end of the 19th century. It housed 2 fire engines, with stables underneath the building. The first fire engines at Ferguslie would have been horse-drawn. It was located across from the Bridge Lane Gatehouse. The number 3 mill was built in the 1950s, and at the time it was the most modern thread mill in Britain. Spinning operations were transferred from the Atlantic Mill when that was closed down over at the Anchor site. The threads produced here were quite specialised, intended for use in the fashion industry. It was pulled down in 1984, but latterly was a crucial source of income as the economy got worse.
It was only maybe about £4 something a week you got, but it helped us because with my husband being out on strike, I had to keep money in the house because our rent had been £9 a quarter in Glasgow, and when we came to Johnson it was £9 a month, and we didn't have much money, so we had to always go out and work. I've always worked.
Right next to the Bridge Lane Gatehouse sat the main spooling store. This stored the spools that were made from spruce in the turning shop, which was located just across the road. Following the canal, a little to the east of the gatehouse, a footbridge straddles what remains of the Glasgow, Paisley and Johnston Canal. The canal was built by the civil engineer Thomas Telford. This bridge has close connections with Paisley's weaving trade because of its association with the poet Robert Tannahill. Tannahill is known as the Weaver Poet due to his original occupation. On the 17th of May 1810, just months before the canal was open to traffic, Tannahill's body was found in this spot, and since then this place has become known as Tannahill's Hole. A contemporary of Robert Burns, it is thought that Tannahill decided to take his own life after a collection of his poetry was rejected by an Edinburgh publisher. He was just 36. Today the footbridge is blocked off at one side, but originally it provided access to the half-timers' school. The girls who worked in the number 1 mill would cross the bridge in the early afternoon to receive lessons. Built in 1890 with some later additions, the counting house was the financial hub of the Ferguslie site. It would have been familiar to everyone on the site because this was where the wage packets were made up. On the bottom floor was the general manager's office, a showroom and a technical department. The standards department, which determined exactly how workers should do their job and what was expected of them regarding output, was also here. This ensured that the piecework system could be applied practically, with work rated in terms of pence per spool. Most of the women who worked on the production floor were paid in this way. Some workers were, however, on time work, being simply paid for the hours that they put in. The working conditions in the wages department could be quite demanding.
It was very strict. We had these boards where everything was set up, the sheets, and with the calculations and everything. We weren't allowed to speak to each other. We had a break in the morning and afternoon. You could speak to the pay clerk, so obviously because you had to deal with things if you couldn't understand what was written on or what was worked out on the piecework sheets. There was only one time I went out into the mill with one of the pay clerks to give out wages. Don't know why I did that. They must have been short of somebody, I can't remember of that. But we had a good crowd and we had nights out because everybody that got married had to leave. So every time somebody was getting married, we had a night out.
Before wages were paid directly into bank accounts, a pay clerk would take the weekly payroll to the various mills on the site. The clerk would call the supervisor on each floor, who would then summon the workers, who would form an orderly line for their wage packets. After Coates sold the northern part of the Ferguslie site in 1972, the counting house suffered neglect, vandalism and fire damage. The facade of the building remained intact, however, and the site was redeveloped into an apartment complex. The counting house is close to where the original production mills stood. An L-shaped complex of 7 mill buildings and an engine house once stood here. It included the original number 1 mill, the Old Mill, dating from 1826. The later Victorian constructions, built when modern larger machinery was developed, were of a much larger scale. Built in 1890, this was another iconic red brick mill building, 6 stories high, built on an L-plan. It was turreted at both ends with a central section rising up from the ground floor towards an inserted clock face at the top. This is where the yarn was taken after the spinning process, where it would be twisted and then packaged for various ensuing wet processes.
The heat was fantastic. See with the frames going, well the noise you get used to it, but the heat, so management very kindly installed Coca-Cola machines, stone cold Coca-Cola. Now you know the heat, they did a bomb. This young guy came in, you know, saying, oh look at that, that's a fine boy. And I had a look at him and thought, oh well, that's nice. And every time I seen him, another bottle of Coca-Cola. It took him a couple of months to ask me out. Believe me, he was handsome, blonde hair, red complexion, he had a green suit on, and I mean he was young. The guy before him was an old guy, and he'd looked at him twice. I bagged him and I went out with him.
Both men and women wore as few clothes as decency allowed, and possibly for this reason, one of the floors, or flats, was a men's only production area right up to the end in the late 1970s. Behind the number 8 mill were buildings known as the wings. They housed more lightweight machinery than would be found in the twisting mill. Yarn from Ferguslie and elsewhere would also be stored here in sheds. The number 9 twisting mill, another large Victorian red brick building with 6 floors, was alongside. As the site was being wound down, it was mainly used for basket making and general storage purposes. This part of the site was always packed with vehicles because the transport office was located here as well. Coates owned a fleet of electric vans, which would be used to transport lightweight packages between the mills on the site. This terrace was known as the firemen's cottages. A bell linked the houses to the fire station. They were not occupied by ordinary labourers, but by more senior staff, mostly mill overseers. Number 85 and 87 date from around 1820. This was John Coates' first house in the area. At the time, he decided to focus solely on thread manufacture and chose to live close to the original mills. Opposite Maxwellton Road Terrace is a detached sandstone building, number 68. Another Woodhouse and Morley building dating from 1886. This was the former clerk's dining hall where office staff and management would come to eat. The first floor was used by foremen and sub-managers, while the managers and directors would dine on the second floor.
In Maxwellton Street, there's a building known as the staff canteen. It's 1, 2, 3-storey building. We were allowed into the bottom flat because we were only foreman and sub-manager at that time, but the managers and directors were in the second flat next to the kitchen, so they get the best service.
Today, the building houses a Masonic lodge. A little further down the street stands another Coates building. It was designed in 1899 by local architect Thomas Graham Abercrombie and was used by the Coates firm as a workers' hostel. Known locally as the Highland Girls Building, it was used to house young women, some of whom came from the Highlands to find work. The building is now divided into studio apartments. It was once connected via an open-air walkway to the building behind it, the Old Girls' Club. The former Paisley Coates Girls' Club, or the Girls' Club for short, was opened in 1901. Like the Highland Girls building behind it, it was designed by Thomas Graham Abercrombie. This building on Ferguslie Road was closely connected to the Highland Girls building, and it was a place where the young women who worked in the mills could socialise with one another. Over the years, it has also been used by various organisations, including the Girl Guides and latterly the Sea Cadets. It used to house the original Coates Museum, which displayed various artefacts, including old machinery. Like the Half-Timer School, the structure is now classified as at risk. The North, or West Lane Gatehouse, dates from around 1890. Like the other two gatehouses, this building was where workers would clock in and out at each end of their shift. Staff would congregate under its now long gone glass canopy before their working day started. Next to the gatehouse is a driveway, closed off by cast iron gates. This entrance was used by motor vehicles and originally horses and carts to access the site. The gates were operated hydraulically by the staff inside. The gatehouse was a good vantage point for the whole site and was used by firemen to keep watch for smoke or flames. Like so many of the original buildings that remain on the Ferguslie site, it fell into a serious state of disrepair once production ceased. Coates sold the building in 1972 and it was used by a number of different businesses. Eventually, it fell into a state of dereliction, was badly vandalised and repeatedly set on fire. The building was, however, renovated and converted into housing. Behind the North Gatehouse is all that remains of a cluster of store and stable buildings that was demolished in the 1990s. The surviving gable end dates from around 1858 and formed part of a building where thread was stored before being transported along the canal. Across Maxwellton Road from the White House is the rear of a large red brick villa that faces onto Ferguslie Road. This house was used by the firm's general managers. Latterly, it was used by site foremen, who would manage the various trades related to the site and delegate activity. Ferguslie stables can be found opposite the general manager's house, a little further out of town. In common with so many of the Coates buildings, the overall effect seems to overshadow its practical purpose. Dating from 1870, the building is of the Scots baronial style, very fashionable in the latter half of the 19th century. It wasn't intended for the mills, however. It stands beside the former entrance to Ferguslie House, a former Coates family home. The stables housed various livery employees who served the Coates family. They would have been on constant call. The main part of the building was where the groundsmen who looked after Ferguslie House's gardens were quartered. Ferguslie House itself is long gone, and this is now public parkland. At one time, a bridge connected the island with the grounds. The house was built in 1828. Thomas Coates moved his family into Ferguslie House in 1845. During the First World War, it was used as a hospital and first aid station, the family having moved on some years before. It was demolished soon afterwards. There's around 150 years of industrial history to be explored here. Just after the Second World War, there were 9 working mills and scores of ancillary buildings. The 1970s saw the beginning of the end for thread making in this town, and production has long since gone elsewhere. Most of the buildings didn't survive the early 1990s, but hopefully enough remains to remind us of Ferguslie's distinguished heritage and the sheer scale of the activity that took place here.